Hello, I'm Jeff Webb, and today we're going to cover a shot that was in my latest personal project, Memory of a Stolen Car. I had a comment that said, hey, I love the compositing on this. So I wanted to jump in and just show you a rough idea of how I did this. So I'm going to stop playing that. I'm in After Effects here. I have my denoised main shot and everything else composited on top. So I really want to start with how I got it out of Cinema 4D. So I'm going to jump over to Cinema 4D, and I started working in Octane and Cinema 4D around the same time. And I just sort of used this great tutorial to try and get a little bit more of an understanding of these EXR workflows. I ended up coming across this and it was really insightful. So thank you, Silverwing. I'll link to this. But basically, I wanted to show you how I did this. So here's my scene in Cinema 4D. I have the shot over here, and this is the Octane view. I'm in R19. I have the live viewer from V4.05 R7. That's just sort of what I had at the time. This project took a while to complete outside of my job responsibilities. I was doing this in my personal time, so that's what I was using. Things have changed quite a bit, I'm sure, between the newest version of Octane, but if you have this version or if you're using R19 or whatever, I'm just going to walk through what that is. So I have the denoised passes here. I have my main pass, denoised beauty, noise pass, diffuse direct pass, denoised diffuse indirect, denoised reflection direct, denoised reflection indirect, denoised emission, denoised remainder, and post. Post-processing is really nice because when you get into your composite, it's really something that you don't have to fake with After Effects or anything. It just looks really nice once you get it into the comp. So if I'm looking at my denoised main, I'm going to let it go there. It says 5 minutes, but hopefully it won't take all that long. I have all my Octane settings here, so I'll run through those. I generally used path tracing on here, and this is what I had set up. This adaptive sampling is really, really great. It kills a lot of the noise. This is just sort of how I had it set up. So you can pause that if you want and check it out, but I'm going to keep running through here. So for camera imager, that's more or less like the global change. I use the response gamma and LUT or LUT, and the response is linear, and then gamma was 2.2. So I just set these to taste because, you know, the hot pixel removal in some shots is different than the others. So this is a really nice global way to change everything. You have that flexibility in your cameras as well. And I have my cameras here. Let's see. So over here we have camera imager, and if you enable that, you have all of those settings, but that's generally not where I'm enabling any of that. This is just one shot. This is the tunnel shot. I'm setting my camera imager here, and then one and done. These are just tests or different things that I had. So if I go through again, enable denoising is super helpful. It's been a lifesaver in Octane. And denoise on completion is really great because I don't want it to denoise over time. I would rather just have it be done on completion, and then I can check it once I get over here into my live viewer. Denoise volumes I don't use because I'm not using volumes in here. And then for custom LUT, not really using those much. As far as post, I really, really like the bloom power, and all of this stuff makes those really nice passes in your post. I'm not going to touch that because then it's going to try and reload over here, but please understand that that's what that setting does. And as far as devices, I read somewhere that you could plug in your least powerful GPU to your best monitor, and then you could plug in your most powerful GPU to sort of calculate everything else in the background. And that's how I've been using this dialogue. You can drop down, but normally I'm setting it on priority high or medium, but there are better references online than me. So please check something else out about this area. This is going to be different if you have like an insane rig or if you don't have an insane rig. I had quite a few crashes in this version just because you can switch this, and I use these both for denoising at the same time. Maybe I'll do that now. I don't think that the live render will switch over till it's done. Other than that, those are my kernel settings. Let me bring this over here. Octane settings are right here, and then these are my render settings. And as far as the render settings go, I just have my output set up at 1080p. Under save, this is my saved file, open EXR 32-bit. I can always come back to this and it's a really high quality version. But then I'm also doing multipass. Multipass is checked on here, but it's really under Octane render, and this is the drop down for Octane render. But if you start over here, I saved myself a preset, and this one's just high quality multipass. It is resend only updated objects, all objects movable, check materials every frame. This motion blur is very high. I had issues where the motion blur on the wheels was having a problem, so generally that should be like 1 or 2. For render buffer type, this is pretty important. Float tone mapped is the option I chose here. I love using the denoised beauty pass. I do want to use all my GPUs. In this case, when I'm ready to render overnight, yes, I want all these GPUs to be rendering. When I'm working here, maybe not, but right here, I certainly do. So I have overwrite kernel settings. I'm not touching that. Over here, I have all of my render passes from, like I said, the multipass, the Octane render enabled. The render pass file here, I generally name that something like tunnel multipass. But what I really want to do is make these folders. And thank you again, Silverwing, for describing why you would want to do this. Or, you know, I ended up finding that I wanted to do this. His explanation was really great. And I am using the EXR, but it's EXR Octane. So that ended up working out really well. As he said in his tutorial, just be careful with some of the settings here. Do a quick test, make sure that it's going to work for you before you like walk away for the end of the night. But the WAB was really great because it had a high quality and a small file size. He mentioned that it was possibly broken on older versions of Cinema 4D. I'm on R19, so you know, it worked there. I'm using the half float generally. I don't know why it's not switched on here, but the half float is going to be your highlights. And I want to have show passes ticked on and save beauty. That is a beauty pass that I believe is not denoised. I'd like to have it because it's going to take time. I'm just going to render it overnight. If I want to use it, I want to use it. If not, it's there. I can delete it, whatever. But generally, I do save beauty. I don't like multi-layer file. I do like folders, and that's sort of what I was describing, and that's what it'll look like. It'll have a ton of folders for your, in my case, denoised stuff. For the image color profile, I have these both set to linear. Okay, and for the beauty passes, I don't like the beauty passes except for post. At least for this project, it was just too noisy, so I used post. And then for denoiser passes, I used almost all of them. So these are how they come into the file name as well, so you can really tell what's going on. And for the render layer, I'm not touching these, but you can. For the lighting passes, I didn't touch that either. But in here for the info passes, I do like to have this matte ID, and the matte ID shows up here as MID in your folder structure. As far as this stuff goes, I'm not touching these. That works out pretty well. So that's how I have it set up for the high quality multipass. This is all rendered out. This took about 4 minutes while I was talking here. So if I have my main, you can see it's really pretty noisy. This adaptive sampling is really nice. So that's how far you get without denoising. I don't really want to denoise in After Effects as much if I don't have to, because this is very, very powerful. I can see it pretty quickly in the live viewer. So that's the difference between the denoised beauty. I really like how that cleaned up. You do lose detail, but to me, because it's animated, you're not losing that much. You can always sharpen it a little bit later, but it looks really great. And here's the noise. Here's your denoised diffuse direct. So if I run through these, you can kind of see how you could use these later. But here's your denoised emission, denoised remainder, matte ID, material ID. I really like using this just because this didn't add a whole lot of render time. I know that a lot of folks were talking about CryptoMatte when it came out. I didn't actually try that yet just because I was still on this older version of Octane, but Matte ID ended up being really nice for me. And then here's your post stuff. I would set that overnight to render. It's all done. And then I get the Z depth by switching over here, and you can kind of see roughly what that looks like. It renders very, very fast. So I have my Z depth here and I have my high quality multipass JW preset. But if I have my Z depth selected, you kind of need to be on Z depth here, and then this Z depth pass will show up in here, Octane render. And then I just labeled it as Z depth, and then I'll put it in a separate folder. Basically, it's the same type of EXR Octane WAB show passes. This one I did save beauty. I also did the folders, but here's where the main difference is. So if I switch over, I'm going to have this render passes selected, and I'm going to have this render passes selected and just toggle. So you can see Z depth here should really say linear and then tone mapped. And this should say linear or linear if you're doing your regular multipass. But if you're doing just the Z depth, I found that I had a real headache here. And the headache was this toggle between linear and tone mapped. So make sure that if you're doing a Z depth, at least, this is how I found that it worked well. Linear and then tone mapped for the Z depth. And that info pass is down here. You want to have Z depth checked. 200 samples is what I have that set for Z depth. If you click here, and then if you use this slider for Z depth max, I really wanted it to expose that area so you can see how that works. For some reason, when you're on the main, it doesn't show it, but if you're on Z depth and you have to be on this Z depth as well, it'll show it. But I think 863 was where I landed on that one. So I'm going to type that in. Boom. So that area is going to be pretty much completely blown out, but in here is where I really wanted that volume. Once the Z depth is set up, make sure that you have Z depth dropped down here if you have open the live viewer. Let's say you didn't have the live viewer open. Make sure that your Octane settings, if you want the Z depth pass, make sure that it says info channels, Z depth. I like to match these up generally. If you don't, there are discrepancies between those, but this is normally where I'm setting my final output settings and everything. Once this is all set, export this out. It should go pretty quickly compared to the other stuff. For this save beauty, I do this just because I had a really tricky time understanding which one was which. So if I export all of that out, I have all my folders ready to go. Let's jump over to After Effects. So if we're in here, again, this is what the shot looks like, and I generally am going to start at the bottom. So if I just focus on this one layer or solo this one layer, I basically have a Lumetri color on here, and I'm going to pull the scopes over here. I normally use 2 monitors, but here we go. So you can kind of see where we're at. Parts of this are really saturated, but I have my Lumetri color here, and I'm pulling everything way down. This is what it looks like straight out of the renderer, and I'm going to toggle between the source names and you can kind of see what's going on. But this is my denoised main, and I have my other passes in here, but when I pull them over here as the EXR sequences, if I want to import all of these, I'm importing them separately. And this is what they look like, just like they did in Octane. So you can kind of see why they would be useful, hopefully. And if I was to import multiple files, so here's tunnel, and I'm looking for 5. I'm just selecting all of these, and then I'm doing open EXR sequence, boom, and I'm importing those, and then I'm going through and importing each one of these. If I was just using the beauty pass, it wasn't exactly working the way that I wanted it to. So I brought in all these separate passes myself. So if you have your tunnel denoised main here and you turn on the Lumetri that I put on, I'm just trying to crush everything and sort of get it to a baseline where I'll be happy. And then I have my denoised emission, and that's sort of the lights here. And I don't think I have anything on there. I'm going to turn on the denoised diffused indirect, so you can kind of see what's happening there. That's what it looks like soloed out. So for some of the layers, I'm turning them down, like this one is 58% opacity. And there was a human shape. There's parts in here where it really doesn't look like there's a human being in there, and there's not. I didn't put a model in there or anything, primarily because I didn't want to throw a model in there. I wanted it to be ambiguous anyway. So I have a dark shape in there, and that's what that's for. And if I show you there's a matte, and I'm using the matte ID here. And the matte ID is really useful just because, you can use this as a color key. You can color key it, and that's like a down and dirty way to do it. I actually think that didn't work out for me, so I just masked it. So this is my denoised diffuse direct. If I just have the passes on that I wanted, basically that's just raising up the brightness of the certain areas in the concrete and a little bit of the car as well. This is a denoise reflection. And so I really wanted something to pop with the car. So that's sort of where we're at. And the denoise reflection, that's all the highlights in certain parts of the shot. So I'm really just laying all of these over top of the beauty pass to make it something more. Because especially this part was dark. So that really brings back everything here. If I just keep going, here's a denoise reflection again. And it looks like I just used that primarily for down here in the tunnel. I wanted to sort of make that pop a little bit, but I think that down here it was really not working. So I used the Z depth to do that. And if I turn on the Z depth, if you turn off the levels, that's how it comes in, and it's really flat. It's not going to help you as much as if you crush down the different parts that you want, and you can see that really well in the scopes and everything over there. So if I have the Z depth there, you can really see it's only affecting when I turn it on and turn it off. It's only affecting the end of the tunnel. So I'm going to turn that off. And then I have my denoise reflection direct. That's really on the tires. I felt like the tires didn't have enough pop, or they were kind of getting lost, or it looks too CG. If it's like, hey, it's completely black there. It's not even colorful at all. So that's where that comes in. And I think I used the matte ID for that as well. For the matte ID, all I was doing was keying out that small part. And this is not the best way to do it, but this is a way to do it. I color keyed that out and made it softer. And then that's the only part that's being revealed. So it is the whole reflection direct pass, but it's just being masked out. And then this is the fog color, and the fog color is down there at the end. And you can see how that works with the Z depth. Same thing with the Z depth that I showed you earlier. And when it comes in, it's pretty flat, but you can really art direct it. And I really like that you can see down here what's happening. I wanted to make it subtle. I'm using the Z depth pass there to add back that fog. And the fog, I think I had a fill on there, but I turned it off, and I ended up using a gradient ramp. So if I turn that on and off, you can see what's happening. I wanted a subtle gradient that went from the end of the tunnel to emulate the lights that are outside the tunnel to the light blue that's inside the tunnel. And I'll just slide these coordinates around for the end of the ramp so you can see. Hopefully that gives you a better idea of how that works. I'm just dragging the different areas. And in some ways, I didn't want it to be too extreme. I mean, that, it's really to taste, but that's sort of where I ended up. I wanted you to be able to focus on the car, and I'll just turn on these other layers. So here's my post effects, and that adds another layer of that fog as well, just like sort of a foggy look. And I have my Z depth for that. If I hit F4, so the post is using that layer as a LumaMatte. If I turn on my denoise remainder, taillights pop a little bit more. And then there's a line here. I wanted to make like a metal edge. If you watch it at the beginning, it is pretty bright and kind of distracting. It takes your eye away from the car, and I really didn't want that. So if I just go to a part that's pretty bright, I have a mask here and it's just this area. Let me look what's going on. So I have a matte ID that's above it, and I'm using that as an alpha inverted matte to darken the top of it. So you can kind of see it really crushes it to the point where it's not all the way black, but it's dark enough that there's somewhat of a gradient on there. And that's all I was trying to do with this. And then as far as post, I think it's just on the back of the car to brighten it up. Here's another post, and that's really to brighten up as it gets closer to the camera. And here's a curves vignette. It all was looking a little too same brightness, and I wanted to have it be more focused on the car and then sort of these guiding lines. So I really put a heavy vignette on there. I really wanted to art direct this and make sure that it was telling a story. And I feel like at this point, you're going from the daylight and nighttime to sort of an unknown area. And I wanted the fog to sort of represent that. I didn't want fog throughout the whole piece. I really just wanted it to be like a confusion. And there's a piece of the comp from another part that was screwed up. It's more or less a patch. Let's see. So normally when I'm looking at the values on here, I have a black and white level, or let's see what it was. It was just a hue and saturation. And I just put that over it to see what the brightest parts are and what the darkest parts are to sort of get a read on it without color. And you can see what's going on with it and without it. And I'm going to toggle that. So that's about it. I'm going to unsolo all of these so you can see the final comp without the black and white on it. And that's how I achieved this using Cinema 4D, Octane Render, and After Effects. Thank you for joining me. Goodbye.